because this is the last time we're due to meet for a while, I'm sure you'll spend the summer going over all the classes all the stuff we've learned together. And just before Tisha B'Av, which is the time of celebration, if you like, of the destruction, loss of Israel, Temple, Jerusalem. So let's take a look at that subject. Fundamental subjects goes much deeper than we used to thinking. In order to appreciate the lack or the loss of Israel in the broader sense, including Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, the Beis HaMikdash, the Temple, what does it mean? And the first step in regaining that is to feel its loss. It's very clear in our sources that you can only rejoice at something that you know you lost. If you lost it and lacked it and longed for it, then it's a rejoicing when you rediscover it. As we've mentioned before, we've said that a person longs to get married because it's a longing for the part of yourself that was once there. You only long for something that was once part of you, so you have an identity. And in order to merit the rebuilding and being brought back to Israel, we need to feel the loss, right? The verse says that all those who mourn over Jerusalem should rejoice in its rebuilding. The meaning is that only if you mourn can you rejoice. It's like when a person disappears, a man disappears. So his wife is devastated. I mean, some wives, of course, probably rejoice, but in a normal situation, his wife is devastated. The children broken. The neighbors very upset. Not as much as the family. People down the block. It's not good news. And the people on the next block have no idea. When he comes home, his wife, hopefully, she's overjoyed. The kids are very happy. The neighbors smile. People down the block think it's good news, and people on the next block, no response. In proportion to the longing and to the missing is the rejoicing. And so that's why we dwell on this, and we've spent a couple of thousand years dwelling on this loss, because it's something that's part of us. So what is the meaning of Israel? You know that the land of Israel is not only a national homeland. That's the very least aspect of its significance to us. Every nation is partly defined by its land. In our case, very remarkable that much of our history has been spent off the land. But it doesn't alter the fact, as our great commentaries say, that part of the definition of what we are is the place. But in our case, it isn't only because there's a national homeland that unites us as the common place. That place is very special. That our place is the center of the world, right? Our function, what is different about us than the non-Jewish nations? What's different about us? Every non-Jewish nation has a special, unique identity. There's 70 nations or 71 nations. Each of them is playing a different part in that orchestra. They're all necessary. The Gaon of Vilna explains 35 of the nations of the world come from the Esav side, 35 come from the Ishmael side. There's 70 essential players. When the Messiah finally is revealed, every nation will come bringing its own unique cultural identity that will not be effaced. It'll be necessary. We don't want all the orchestra instruments to play the same thing. We want each one to be playing its own part. In fact, even at that time, conversion to Judaism will not be allowed. Many reasons for that. But so what's the difference? What's unique about us? Every nation has its uniqueness and has to have its uniqueness. Now, Rav Tzadok HaKohen says that, the Gemara says that we were exiled only to find converts. Amazing statement, right? The only reason the Jewish people were exiled among the nations is to find converts. That people should convert to Judaism. Which is quite a weird statement, because first of all, since when are we anxious for converts? On the contrary, we discourage people to convert. If someone comes to convert to Judaism, we say you don't need to. You can be a fine, moral human being, observing all the laws that you need to observe. I didn't even get going yet, just have a heart. You don't need to convert to Judaism. We don't look for converts to Judaism. And yet the Gemara is saying the only reason we were exiled was to pick up converts. So it's well known that the Kabbalists explain that the reason we were exiled to all of the earth, and you'll find Jews everywhere, you'll find Jews absolutely everywhere, and in most places they're running the show. But be that as it may, or else arguing about it, be that as it may, the Kabbalists explain that we went to all parts of the earth to attract back the sparks that got lost. The fire of Sinai, there were many sparks that flashed off from the event, and many of them got lost. That's why the Zohar says that converts to Judaism are actually souls that are finding their way back. Whatever that means, in one way or another. But Rabbi Dr Akiva says a fascinating thing. He says converts to Judaism doesn't only mean people. It means bringing home all the facets of Torah, culture, that got lost. Right? Every nation has its own unique culture. Even today, we have a principle today that the cultures of the world are no longer their authentic original cultures. The king Sancheriv, his policy was to distort national identity. He shipped populations from one place to another. Part of his conquering philosophy was, if you wrench people out of their milieu and you put them someplace else, then you break their spirit, you break their motivation to fight for their homeland, their place. And so he mixed up all the nations. Other reasons as well. But today we cannot identify authentically. One of the reasons we can't identify Amalek, or for that matter any national group with its unique identity, is because they've all been mixed together. And yet, despite that, you still see that nations and countries have unique identities. The French are not the Italians, right? They have their own unique approach to things. German people have a certain, although this is a generalization, but it's valid, right? There's a German personality, and there's a British personality. So Rav Tzadok HaKohen says that we were exiled all over the world to bring home aspects of culture that got lost from Torah. Torah is the composite culture with all the beautiful facets of human culture and intellect, and that got lost. And every nation on earth now is playing a tune, playing a melody that represents its unique heart, its spirit. It's the fact that Italians function a certain way or don't function a certain way. If you look at Italian politics, whatever it is. The point is that the expression, the culture and the language and the tastes and the defining characteristics of the art and culture of a nation is an expression of its spiritual being. And all of those are supposed to harmonize together. It's no accident. It's not wrong that each nation has a different culture and a different... On the contrary, it's important. And he says that the reason we were exiled among the nations was to bring back the cultural elements, the spiritual, cultural, emotional, intellectual elements that were all facets of Torah. Not just people, but elements of culture. And in the end, humanity will be a incredible united orchestra of each individual, each family, each nation fulfilling an absolutely unique role in human history. And then it will be revealed. So what are we? What's our unique? Which instrument are we playing, if you like? And the answer is, what we are supposed to be doing is the connection to the source. That's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be the connection to the spiritual world. The non-Jewish nations, the Esav nations, are supposed to be building the world. They're supposed to be building the world. They were given the job. The Esav nations, their power's in their hands. They were supposed to be a twin partner to Yakov. And their work was to perfect the world. By the way, it's very interesting. If you stop any educated Westerner on the street and you ask them, what's the purpose of life? What is the purpose of being here? They'll probably say to make the world a better place, if they're idealistic. And I think they're right. Their job is to make the world a better place. For what purpose? So that the world can be a perfected environment in which the spiritual can manifest.
Only the physical. Only the physical.
What other world are you thinking of?
Spiritual.
Their job is to make the world a better place in all its dimensions. And our job is to connect the lifeline to the source that feeds in the connection to Hashem, to God. You see this very clearly. The work of Esav, the work of the Esau nations is to build the world. Just give you an example. Do you know that a non-Jew can keep any mitzvah that he wants? A non-Jew can voluntarily fulfill a mitzvah. There are two mitzvahs that a non-Jew is not allowed to fulfill. Learning Torah for its own sake, and keeping Shabbat. They're absolutely not allowed to. Why not? A non-Jew can sit in a sukkah, he can take a lulav, he can eat matzah on Pesach, and he gets reward for it. Yes, strictly speaking. Strictly speaking, yes. You can wear tefillin if you like. Not recommended. Not recommended. Good.
Look into it.
But learning Torah for its own sake and keeping Shabbat not. No, that a non-Jew is not allowed to do. Why? What's wrong with that? I'm not talking about learning the Torah that he needs, the 7 mitzvahs of the non-Jews. Of course he has to study. It was written that Avram Avinu, before there was so-called Jews in the world, he had 400 volumes on the laws of idolatry. It was very important. He had to know that.
So for academic study, they can learn that? Torah?
Academic learning of
So
Torah?
it's not for its own sake. It's not.
No, learning the practical side of Torah. Well, it's going to be a long night, I can see. The heckler's already alive and well. There's a complex halachic debate about what aspects of Torah you can teach to a non-Jew. And there are many opinions. Many opinions argue they can learn Chumash, but not Gemara. Some say they can learn Gemara, but not Kabbalah. It's a whole discussion. I'm not going into that now. The question is, why is a non-Jew not allowed to learn the essence of Torah for its own sake? And why is he not allowed to keep Shabbos? I'm not talking about a weekend. He can have a weekend. But he cannot keep Shabbos. And the answer is very clear. The answer is because these are two things that are outside the world. Learning Torah means connecting with the spiritual source directly, not bringing it into the world. Into the world is called mitzvahs. But learning Torah for its own sake, connecting to the root for its own sake, right, is out of the world. And Shabbos is stepping out of the world. Shabbat is where you stop creating the world. Shabbat is where you take your hands off and you stop the creative activities. A non-Jew who does that is forfeiting his reason for existence. He's here to build the world, to have his hands on. He's here to perfect the world. That's his job. Our job is to connect it to the source. If a non-Jew keeps Shabbat, that means he says, for this day I'm not engaging with the world. He's here to engage the world. That's his purpose. If you don't like it, you're not well adjusted. You know, if you're a woman, you need to be well adjusted to womanly mitzvahs. If you're a man, you need to be well adjusted to masculine mitzvahs. Right? If you're a Jew, you have Jewish functions. If you're a non-Jew, you have to know what that means. If you really don't like it, you can convert. Again, not recommended. But that is the idea, and therefore that's our function. And therefore, here's the key: the land of Israel is the place where that is perfectly possible. The land of Israel is the point of connection to the spiritual world. That's what has to be understood. The world's creation began there. The world unfolds from Israel, from the center of the temple in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Holy of Holies, to Jerusalem, to the temple, to Jerusalem, to Israel, and from there it fans out to the rest of the world. As you move towards Israel in concentric circles, you move towards the center of existence. Let's understand this. First of all, you know it's very clear. There's so many sources. One obvious source that is so well known. The Ramban says famously that mitzvahs are only real in Israel. Mitzvahs. Mitzvahs. When you eat matzah and you sit in a sukkah in England, you're practicing. You're practicing. He says so that when you get back to Israel, it won't be new. It won't be unfamiliar. Play acting. In a certain sense. But mitzvahs are only real in Israel. That's the place of connection to Hashem, and that's the place where it can be manifest, where the behavior, that behavior can be manifest. Apart from the fact that living in Israel is a mitzvah, just walking around there is a mitzvah. Certainly owning property. Everybody should be living there, all else being equal. But he says that mitzvahs are really only fulfilled in Israel. One of the proofs for that, many proofs, one of the proofs is that when you examine the people who kept the Torah before it was obligatory, like Avraham, Yitzhak, Yakov, they kept the Torah voluntarily, right? So the question is often asked, why did Yakov marry 2 sisters? You're not allowed to marry 2 sisters. Right? Not allowed to marry 2 sisters. He married 2 sisters. One of the answers that's given is because he did that before the Torah was commanded. So he fulfilled the Torah voluntarily. That means they understood the spiritual nature of Torah and they lived it, even though they were not specifically commanded. But one of the answers to that question is because he lived outside Israel. And you can marry 2 sisters outside Israel because mitzvahs are only binding in Israel. And that's very significant. As he traveled towards Israel, as he crossed the border, one of them died. Rachel died on the border. That's where she's buried in Efrat. Why? Because to go into the land of Israel, married to 2 sisters, where the mitzvah becomes obligatory. Where it's essentially obligatory, that's not. That he couldn't do. There are many other proofs. And therefore, I hate to tell you this, but when you're living outside Israel, you're like at the back of the grandstand. You're at the last row of seats, and you kind of, vaguely out there someplace there's a stage where something's happening, but, it's like wrapped in layers of cotton wool, nothing's. If you've ever lived in Israel, you know what I mean. I mean, moving there can be quite a shock to the system. That's where you get hooked up to the voltage. And you see it in the personalities. Israel is the kind of place that brings out extremes in personality. Brings out the good very good and brings out the bad very bad. It's a place that accentuates, it amplifies. It's a very good amplifier for spirituality. The Chofetz Chaim used to warn people, you shouldn't go to Israel unless you're ready. If you're going to go there and misbehave, you're misbehaving in the palace of the king. You're much more accountable. So it's like the spiritual center of the world, and therefore there's a certain resonance. And that's the great longing of the Jewish people for Israel, is because they're connecting to the source of life there. You know that one of the ways you see this is that a land, one of the meanings of a land is where seed is planted. And that's where growth takes place. And of course the ultimate planting of seeds in the land is bearing people. Bearing people, right? That's the ultimate planting of a seed. And the growth is called Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead. And the Maharal says that Tchias HaMesim, we know that the resurrection of the dead will take place in Israel. People who die will be resurrected in Israel. If you're buried outside Israel, you'll be taken through underground tunnels under the ground and come up in Israel. One of the reasons that many people throughout the ages have insisted on being buried in Israel, and this is not something that should be generally done, and many people have tried to move there, at least at the end of their life, so they would die and be buried in Israel, is because the Tchias HaMesim will take place from there. What does that mean? Why is it not possible for people to be resurrected in Bangkok or wherever they live, and then you'll travel? What's the problem? The Medrash Tehillim says that if you're born in Israel, anyone here born in Israel? Who is born in Israel? The Medrash says that if you're born in Israel, when the Mashiach arrives, the non-Jews will escort you back. It's a verse in Tehillim, Ish ve'ish yulad sham. If you're born in Israel, when the Mashiach arrives, your neighbors will pick you up and will take you back there. Pay for your ticket.
Did you just say it's not recommended that you be buried in Israel?
No, not if you live here. If you live here, to take a dead body specifically, no.
Why not?
It's called to contaminate the land. You're contaminating the land, bringing dead bodies there. Why do you want to do that? If you move forward here, they'll have a place to sit. If you have a special connection to Israel, you should be buried there. If you lived there, you had a special longing to go there, some special connection to the land of Israel, that could be. Anyway, that's not our subject. But the point is that it's the source of Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead. That's from Israel. That is in Israel. It means that, doesn't only mean the resurrection of the dead, it means that all death will be resurrected. The Gaon of Vilna says something amazing. The verse says, Hisna'ari me'afar kumi. Hisna'ari me'afar kumi. Shake yourself off and arise from the dust. Right? Talking about the Messianic age. Shake yourself off, hitna'ari, that means to shake. Me'afar kumi, and arise from the dust. So the simple meaning is, you're laying in the dust. The dead bodies are laying in the dust. The Jewish people are not alive, spiritually, metaphorically, in many other ways. In the Messianic age, you'll be arise from the dust. The Gaon of Vilna says it doesn't mean arise from the dust where you are. It means arise from the dust that you are. You have become dust. It's not that you're lying in the dust. That's what you are. We're so devoid of life. Right? The Tchias HaMesim means a real coming back to life. So the Gaon of Vilna, the Maharal says in one place that the Tchias HaMesim will be from the Machpelah. The Machpelah, the cave in Hebron. Hebron means a connection, by the way. Hebron. Every part of Israel. Once we're talking about Israel, one should know this. Every part of Israel corresponds to a different part of the body. Everything in the world corresponds to a human body. That's clear. But Israel is a human body. The temple is a human body. Yerushalayim is a human body. And parts correspond. There are Kabbalists who explain what each part of the temple, what limb and organ of the body it corresponds to. What's the heart and what's the head? What's the arms? What are the feet? Every town in Israel, every town, every city, every place in Israel is a different part of the body. Which city will the Mashiach arise in? In which city will the Mashiach come from? Which city in Israel? Which town? Where will the Mashiach come from? Tel Aviv. Who said Tel Aviv? Who said Tel Aviv? You said Tel Aviv? Who said Tel Aviv? You said Tel Aviv.
Let's try.
Halavai.
Tzfat.
Yes, Tveria. Tveria. You know what Tveria means? Tabur, umbilical cord. The word means it. Tveria. You have to know. That's the umbilicus. Every part of Israel is a different part of the body. Hebron means the place where the lower world connects with the higher world. Chevron means a chibur, a connection. What is Chevron? Two caves, one inside another, one above another. The Machpelah means doubled. Kefel in Hebrew means to be doubled. The Machpelah is two caves. And who's buried there? Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, Avram and Sarah, right? The great forefathers of the world and of Jewish history. They're buried there. Buried means being planted prior to growth. Right? That's what it means. It means being planted. You know that the Talmud says that how do we know how marriage is contracted? How do we know how you get married? How do you get married in Judaism? One of the methods is that you give consideration. The man gives a ring, a gift, money, something of value to the woman, and if she accepts it as a marital contract, then they're married. So the Gemara says, how do we know this? Where does the Torah tell us this? So the Torah tells us because there's a common word in marriage and buying a field. When Abraham bought a field from Ephron, right? He bought a field, he bought the Machpelah, he bought that field with its cave. There it has the word kach, kicha. Kicha means taking. And when a man gets married, it says ki yikach ish isha, when a man takes a woman. So the Gemara says, since the same word is used in the Torah with marriage, the same word is used by buying a field, you learn that marriage is affected in the same way that you buy a field. How do you buy a field? You give value and you acquire the field. So we learn from this that the way you marry a woman legally in Judaism is you give her value and for that she's married. That's what it says. So this is called a gzeira shavah, a classic example in the Torah of a common word. When you have a word used in common in two separate places, you can mix and match the laws. That's a Talmudic technique. That's how the Torah works. The Torah used the same word in two places. It means that the laws of one are connected with the laws of the other. And if you want to know how you affect the legal bond of marriage, then you affect it in the same way that you affect the legal acquisition of a property. Because the same word is used. That's what it says. But think a little bit more deeply. The Torah is a document of infinite wisdom. Why did Hashem have to teach? When Hashem wanted to teach you that you marry a woman in the same way that you make an acquisition of property, at least the same technical mechanism, why did it have to put the clue in the buying of a field? Why there? So the commentary there, Tosfos says, because the woman is a man's field. The woman is a man's field. That's where the seed is planted and that's where growth takes place. Talmud says maybe the man's the woman's field. So no, you don't understand. But listen to what's going on. The woman is the man's field. We learn it from the acquisition of a field. But what field was this? That wasn't a field for planting wheat. This was a field for planting people. What did Avram buy that field for? To be buried there. That's the ultimate planting of a seed that will yield the ultimate growth. A human being is buried there. And what will grow from that is resurrection. And on that, the Talmud held discussion. Will people be resurrected with their injuries and their wounds and then get healed? Will they be resurrected with their clothes? What will Tchias HaMesim look like? Will it be like the wheat growing? How do you understand it? But that's the concept. And therefore we're talking about it's a doubled cave. It's where this world meets a higher world. Chevron is the place of chibur, of connection. And therefore Chevron is the place of ultimate Tchias HaMesim. The people buried there, the origin of humanity, Adam and Eve are buried there. Adam and Chava are buried there, obviously. That's where they've been planted, waiting for the second growth. So the Maral says in one place that all Tchias HaMesim will be from the Machpelah. That when the dead are resurrected, one day the Mashiach is going to be here, and you think you'll be sitting at, Enfield, or I don't know, on some, Bushy. And you'll be sitting there enjoying the sun, and suddenly the ground will shake, and the bones will, the hip bone connected. No. The ground will shake, but because they're moving underground to Israel. Where will they come out from? From the Machpelah. My friend and colleague, Rabbi Hartman, he said when he was preparing his work on the Maharal many years ago, he's probably the most famous editor of the Maharal today. He said many years ago he was editing a book of the Maharals, and he noticed the Maharal says that Tchias HaMesim will occur from Chevron, from the Machpelah. And he said he had no idea where the Maharal got that from. The Gemara doesn't say that. I can assure you Rabbi Hartman knows the Gemara, and there's no place in the Gemara where it says that. And he searched and searched and searched. Where did the Maharal say this from? Maharal writing in 1600. The Maharal, one of our most classic and greatest commentators, he says that all resurrection will take place from the Machpelah. And Rabbi Hartman wanted to know where the Maharal got that from. So he said, it's an interesting story, he said many years ago when he was doing this, he found himself in Bnei Brak one Shabbos morning, and he was walking down the street on his way to shul, and he saw Reb Chaim Kanievsky, one of the great Torah sages of this generation. He saw him walking on his way to shul. In those days he wasn't surrounded by a whole entourage of people, so he ran after him, and as he was walking in the street, He had a few hundred meters to go to the shul. He said to him, the Maharal says that Tchias HaMesim, resurrection of the dead, will take place from the Machpelah. Where does he get it from? So he said, Reb Chaim walked and he said, Bavli, no. Yerushalmi, Medrash Tanchuma, no. Zohar, no. You understand what he was doing? As he was walking along, he said to himself, Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, no. Jerusalem Talmud, no. He had like a 48 times CD-ROM. Like he said, in 200 meters, he got through the whole Babylonian Talmud, the whole Jerusalem Talmud, the whole Medrash Tanchuma, the whole, right? And then he said, Zohar, no. Tikkunei Zohar, he said, yeah. Chapter 6, Tikkunei Zohar, that's war, and that's where it was. So, okay, so you know, all right. So that is the, and that's where it is. That's where it is. So we have Maharal as a source that that the Tchias HaMesim will be from the Machpelah. That is the ultimate, and the Medrash says that the Mashiach, when he arrives after a showdown with the Arabs, we've mentioned that Medrash before, the Medrash says that there will be a showdown with the Bnei Yishmael, a contest between us and them, which they will win, a spiritual contest which they will win to test us. And after going through that showdown, there's now's not the time to go into it, the Mashiach will go to Hebron and he'll wake up the Avos and bring them out of the Machpelah, and then there will be Tchias HaMesim coming out of this. So you see that Israel is deeply connected with their resurrection. We're talking about an eternity. And the Torah makes it obvious time and again that our eternal existence is linked to the land. It's not just a homeland. In so many ways, the Torah says that you'll inherit this land forever. It'll be given to the Shvatim, to the tribes. You know, there's a very interesting question. You know that when the Jewish people sinned, two classic sins, the golden calf and the spies. Right? The spies who went into Israel came back and gave a bad report. And prior to that, the golden calf. There's a fascinating discussion that the Medrash goes through of conversation between Hashem and Moshe, Moses and God. What happened was, on the first occasion when the Jewish people, listen carefully, it's very interesting, amazing. When the Jewish people sinned at the golden calf, Hashem said to Moshe, I'm going to wipe them out. They sinned, idolatry, they don't deserve to be my people anymore, I'm going to wipe them out. And what I will do is preserve you. You were not involved in that sin. I'll make a new nation out of you. I'll make a nation out of you. I promised the forefathers, right, that I would not abandon them. You are a product of the forefathers. You're a child of that lineage. And therefore the rest of the Jewish people wiped out, they forfeited their right to existence. I will rebuild the nation from you. Now Moses, the great advocate for the Jewish people, right? Hashem is giving this information. He realizes he wants me to say something. Why is he telling me this? So he said, Hashem, you can't do that. I mean, it's amazing how you can argue with God, which is another whole fascinating subject, but it happens throughout the Torah. You can't do that. So Hashem says, why not? Because you promised that you would give the land of Israel to the tribes of the Jewish people. You promised. You promised that you would give the land of Israel to the 12 tribes. If you wipe out the Jewish people and you rebuild the nation from me, I represent only one tribe. I'm from the tribe of Levi. You'd be breaking your promise. A nice claim, right? Good claim? No? This is the kind of lawyer you want when your neck is, Let's go through it again. Hashem says, I'm wiping out the Jewish people. But I will keep my promise to keep them in existence. I'll rebuild them from you. You're a product of the Jewish people. Why not? So Moshe said, Hashem, you can't do that. You promised the tribes. You said that the land would be divided among the 12 tribes. Each of them would have a unique inheritance in the land. And if you rebuild the Jewish people out of me, I'm only from the tribe of Levi. What happened to Reuben and Shimon and all the rest of the tribes? Hashem said to him, well said. Well said, I forgive them. Wow. And that's why we survived. Subsequently, when they sinned a year and some time later, they sinned with the spies came back from the land. They brought a bad report. The same conversation. Hashem said, Moshe, I'm going to wipe them out. I'm going to make a new people out of you. And here Moses answers differently. He says, Hashem, you can't do that. Hashem says, why not? What will people say? People say you're not powerful enough. People will say that God is not powerful enough to keep his promises. So God will say, well, sure they will. They'll say, I split the sea and I took you out of Egypt. So Moses, he wasn't fazed by that. He said, yeah, they'll say you're powerful enough to split the sea and redeem us from Egypt, but you're not powerful enough to bring us into Israel. Why? Because there are 31 powerful kings there, and you're afraid of them. So Hashem said to him, okay, fine. So the Jewish people will survive, but not without much trouble. 40 years of wandering in the desert, all sorts of they're all going to die in the terrible stuff. The obvious question is, why didn't Moses make the same claim that he made before? He had an absolute winning answer. He's in this debate with God, whatever that means. He's in this debate with Hashem, and Hashem says, I'm wiping them out, and Moses got a winning claim. His claim is, you wouldn't be keeping your promise. What about all the tribes? You see this problem. Next time the same problem arises, God says to him, right, I'm wiping them out, I'll make you. He didn't mention that winning argument. He makes a much weaker argument. Much weaker. People will say, you're not strong enough. Hashem says, I am strong enough. Not quite. And this is not a winning argument. Because it's good enough to help the Jewish people survive. But not without tremendous decimation. And also, why didn't he had a winning argument? God himself acknowledged that it was an absolute winner. What's your problem?
Not a problem. I think they're just completely different types of arguments. The first one was a technicality.
The first argument was a winning claim. Total winning, hands down defeat. Hashem said to him, well said, you're right, I'm going to save the Jewish people because all the tribes...
Hashem wanted to, Hashem could find another way to do the same thing.
Again, you're missing the point. Let me say it again. You had an argument with God. You won. Okay, you won. He said, I give up. You have a total unbeatable claim. The same argument arises later and you don't mention your unbeatable claim. You mention an inferior claim that saves you only half the day. Well, what are you thinking? What are you telling me God could do whatever he wants? We're talking about a logical argument. This is a debate. Yeah, it's a very strong question. Yeah.
Two things. First thing is maybe he doesn't need to remind God of what he said earlier.
Boy, does he need to remind him. The Jewish people are about to be wiped out. Excuse me 1 second. Why did he need to remind God in the first place? God didn't think of this argument? Just once, let's get this clear. The first time round, God didn't think of this. Is that the point? He did just not think of this argument.
My second point's better.
I hope it's better,
he could have been insinuating that Hashem would be giving a little Hashem.
He did. That's what he said. And it was not a winning argument. Excuse me. The second argument, no, only by the skin of his teeth. Only by the whole generation of Jews dying in the desert. Only by the skin of his teeth. But he had a winning argument. The first argument won hands down, no problem.
The second argument is on Hashem's principles.
Again, let's be logical. Argument 1 is a total hands down win that God himself acknowledges. Doesn't get better than that. Second time round, same problem. He doesn't even refer to that argument. He makes a much weaker claim. Yeah.
You could, with the first argument, you could take a couple of people from each of the tribes and wipe out.
That wasn't what God said. He said, I'm going to make you only the forefather of Jewish people. Why are you changing the story?
The second time around, Hashem is most that first argument. Hashem could have taken 2 people from each of the tribes and wiped.
You're making up your own Torah here. That was not the discussion. The discussion was, I'm going to take you and kill the rest of them. And he said, God, you can't do that. You promised all the tribes. And God said, right, I have to keep them all in existence. I can't just use you. That's a total win. Yeah?
Still testing Moshe as a leader. Because Hashem knows all the answers.
The best test of a leader is to have him say the best claim you can make. What if it's a test of a leader? Why does he fail the test? Yeah.
Was it after Moses was prevented from going to the land of Israel?
No. You're not doing too well, yeah.
Is it because they forsake their land?
Yes. Why didn't you speak up before these people gave you so much trouble? Absolutely. Look what happened. In the first discussion, Hashem said, I'm going to wipe them out and I'll use you. He said, you can't do that. You promised to keep all the tribes alive. And what happened in the second sin? The tribes rejected the land. You can't say you promised us the land and you have to keep your promise to the tribes. They just rejected the land. He couldn't make that. The 12 tribes had just come back from the land of Israel, each one representing their share in the land, and they just rejected the land. They rejected and betrayed their share in the land. You're going to stand there and say to God, you promised to give us each a share in the land, you've got to do that. They just rejected the land. Is this clear?
So what?
Who said so what?
God still promised this about it. It doesn't matter whether they rejected it or not. It's still a promise.
How do you, what kind of chutzpah is it to tell God? What kind of chutzpah is it to say to God, you promised us a share in the land, when your sin has just been a rejection of the land? How do you begin to do that? Again, the claim was, you owe us the land because you promised it to the tribes. The land belongs to the tribes, not to Avram, not to Yitzhak, not to Yakov, but to their children as tribes, because each tribe gets a share in the land. The identity of the Shvatim the tribes of the Jewish people is the identity of the land, and that's the eternity of the Jewish people. Those all go together. Why do you need the tribes? Because you promised the tribes. The 12 tribes have just come back representing each tribe, and they've rejected the land. We don't want to go there. You're now going to tell God that he has to keep his promise to give us the land when they do not want it? So he makes the next best claim he can. This is clear, yeah?
And so what about Caleb and Yeshua who didn't?
They survived. They survived. They all survived. One way or another, but without tremendous suffering and tremendous decimation. Anyway, that is the answer. And the key here to grasp is not this particular problem. The key to grasp is that we live through the land. That's a place of being planted and resurrected. It's not just that we need a homeland. On the contrary, we've lived for thousands of years without a homeland. But that's the ultimate place. This is the deep attachment. It isn't just that we love our land. The Portuguese love their land too. The Ethiopians also, and the Ugandans, and the South Africans. But this is a place of eternity. It's completely different. This is where, let's take one more perspective on this. You know, the Mishnah says, the Gemara says, there's 10 layers of Kedusha in the world. 10 concentric layers. Each one higher and more holy than the next, moving towards Israel. Which means, without going through all 10, you live in the world. The world is a natural place. The earth is the earth. As you move towards Israel, things get more, the sanctity becomes more tangible. The Gemara says that one of them were right. He was moving from Babylon to Israel, from Babel to Israel, and he needed to know when he crossed the border. Today, you know when you cross the border. There's no, they don't let you forget. But in those days, I guess there was no demarcated border, or even if there was, is that necessarily the spiritual border? He kept feeling the stones. He picked up stones. And at a certain point, he said, right, we're here. They said, how do you know? The stones are heavier. The stones are heavier. The stones of Israel are more dense. We mean spiritual density. We don't mean that they got a higher iron content. We're talking about he weighed the stones and he knew when he crossed the border. You're talking about a more weighty reality. The Chazal say like this, that Israel is called Eretz Tzvi. It means the land of the deer. The deeper meaning is the land of desirability. Tzvi in Hebrew means something longed for and desired. But one of the meanings is the land of the deer. And the Midrashim say because a deer has a unique characteristic. When you skin it, the skin appears too small for the animal. The skin is stretched, and when you skin the animal, the skin doesn't look like it's enough. Israel looks too small for its inhabitants. But it's always big enough. And today it's not a question. Today there's so few Jews in the world, it's not an issue at all. But when they come home, who knows how many there'll be? Who knows how many Jews there'll be when we come home? You know that when Sancheriv banished the 10 tribes, so they disappeared. We don't know where they are. 10 tribes. All that was left is 2 tribes. And smatterings, tiny little bits of... We have a principle that no tribe ever gets lost completely. But the majority of the Jewish people have gone. They're legends that they live in Afghanistan. They're a Muslim tribe that have a little piece of a Sefer Torah and they wear tzitzis on their clothes and they bake matzah. Some of that's been documented.
Denmark, the tribe of Dan.
Who?
Denmark, the tribe
Denmark.
of Dan. Yeah. There's also some rumor about the tribe of Dan.
There are so many rumors because we don't know. The Medrash says they live on the other side of the river called the Sambation, and no one can cross that river, which means that you will never discover who they are. Denmark, why do you mention that? There's a legend that the Shinto priests in Japan, they wear tefillin, they got fringes. There's plenty of places, plenty. There's people in South Africa, the Lemba tribe, they say they're the lost children of Israel. They wear Magen David on their arm, they're called...
The Brahmins of India from Abraham.
Of course. There's lots of... The reason there's so many legends is because we don't know. But out there someplace, who knows how many Jews there are? There may be 2 billion. 2 billion. Just figure every woman giving birth to a female lineage of the 12 tribes. You'll be very surprised when it turns out who the Jews are. Very surprised. When they come home. The land is very small. I mean, the borders of the land are not the way they are now. The borders of Israel today are not the biblical boundaries. You know that. Just last week we read the borders of Israel. The modern political borders of Israel are not the biblical Israel. I hate to tell you this, but Eilat is way out. Way out.
From Iraq to the border.
Just to give you a clue, Jerusalem extends to Damascus. Damascus, listen carefully, Damasek in Hebrew is Damascus. Reverse the letters, Mikdash. Mikdash. The temple. That's why you find Damascus. Anyway, lot to talk about here. But be that as it may, those are not the borders. The southern border only extends to Beersheba. But be that as it may, this land has a quality that no other lands do. When you move to Yerushalayim, you move to a higher place, which is a higher level of Kedusha. You know, the Mishnah says that a married couple, can force each other to move to Israel or insist on a fully paid up divorce. Don't try this at home. There's better ways to run your marriage. But if one of the married couple insists on moving to Israel, the other one's forced to move or pay for a divorce. If you live in Tel Aviv, this is for you. You can force your husband to move to Jerusalem. A couple that lives in Tel Aviv, either one can force the other one to move to Yerushalayim or pay for the divorce.
What about Jaffa?
What about it? It's a very wonderful ancient port. You have to be careful with Jaffa because there's a...
That's what I'm asking you, you're not.
I'll tell you why. Because there's a Chevel, a band of Israel that extends above Akko, which is not Israel. There's part that is and part that isn't. You have to know there's a special piece there which you have to look at the map carefully. But be that as it may, Yerushalayim has a higher level of Kedusha. And there the Mishnah says that no one ever said in Jerusalem that they could not find a place to stay. Nobody ever said, Sarali hamakom, it was too narrow for me. I couldn't, meaning, the simple expression is, whenever we went to Jerusalem, even though there were millions of pilgrims going to Yerushalayim, there was always a place to stay. But the spiritual meaning is, Yerushalayim is big enough. That means, apart from the fact that millions of Jews stood in the Azorah, the courtyard of the temple, every Pesach. By the way, when you move from Yerushalayim into the Har HaBayis, where the temple stands, it's a higher level of Kedusha. When you move from there into the courtyard of the temple, it's a miraculous level. There, the notion of space is so powerful. The Mishnah says that they would stand tzfufim. That means when they all came to offer their Pesach sacrifices, all the people would stand in the Azor, in the courtyard, completely squashed together. Umishtachavim revachim. But when they bowed, there was plenty of space. Again, when you stand up, right, you occupy less floor area than when you lie down. I know it depends on your shape, but if you shape the way you ought to be, then when you stand, you occupy less. When you stand, you occupy a footprint that's only an amma by an amma. It's only one amma by one amma. When you lie down, you occupy at least 1 by 3, right? So when the people stood, there was no place left. When they bowed, there was plenty of place around them. A completely miraculous changing of space. Of course, the Balei Musa have a wonderful explanation on a completely different level. They say, again, it's beautiful, beautiful insight. They say when you stand, it's an assertion of your ego. Then everybody's crushed by everybody else. When you bow, which is annulling your ego, there's plenty of place for everybody. Now, that's a beautiful insight, but that's not what's meant literally. But that's the point. And then you're moving into the temple, closer to the source of space itself. There the rules of space start to be bent. And when you move into the Holy of Holies, space disappears completely. The Gemara says we have a tradition that the Aron, the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark in which the Torah was contained in the Holy of Holies, occupied no space. Aron eina min amidah. Eino min amidah. The Ark occupied no space. Meaning, if you measured from wall to wall, you got a certain measurement. If you measured from wall to the Aron, you got the same measurement. Not because the ark shrank. If it did, it would be invalid. It has certain required measurements. Not because the room expanded. If it did, it would be invalid. The room had its dimensions. The ark had its dimensions, and it figured no space. Why? Because when you move to the center of space, space ceases to exist. This is the coming into being of space. The rules, the Rambam explains philosophically, the rules of a system do not apply where the rules are being made. Is that clear? For example, the Kabbalists all explain. The Gemara says, you may not try to understand the system of the 6 days of creation. The 6 days of creation are beyond human understanding. All you can have of them is what the Torah tells us as spiritual principles. But to understand what the world looked like, and that's why they make such tragic errors in modern science. The world is billions of years old and they know what happened to the starlight. You cannot read those things. In the 6 days of creation, where the rules of physics and chemistry are coming into being, the rules don't apply. You can only use the rules of a system where the rules... you can't use the rules to analyze the system when the rules weren't there yet. You're going to make vast errors.
They weren't there yet?
And therefore, says that the example the Rambam gives? He gives a wonderful example. Beautiful example. Classic, such a moving example. The Rambam says, if you want to understand what a fetus looks like in the mother's womb, what does a baby look like in the womb? Do not try to analyze what a baby looks like in the mother's womb from the human body. Because the fetus in the womb is in a situation of coming into being. Its anatomy coming into being. And you cannot use the anatomy of the system to analyze the anatomy of a coming into being. Do you know how he puts it? He puts it very wonderfully. He puts it like this. He says, imagine someone was abandoned as a baby in the forest. He talks about this in another context, but I'm just giving you this example. Imagine a baby abandoned in the forest. And he grows up without no human contact at all. Imagine he's... and he stumbles into human society one day. And imagine he can communicate. So he walks up to a person and he says to him, how did I come to be? You know, my earliest memory, I was a little child in the forest. How did I come to be? So the person says to him, you began inside the body of another person called a woman, underwater, with no air to breathe, with all your anatomy not the way it is now. You know, a child in the womb has holes in his heart. The blood flows in the opposite direction than it does to you. He's got no lungs. The lungs of a newborn child are completely closed. He breathes in water and breathes it out. One of the biggest blood vessels in the body takes the blood away from the lungs, exactly the opposite to the way it is in you. He's got blood vessels coming out of his umbilicus. He's got a different sort of blood which would kill you if you had it. His whole anatomy and physiology is completely the reverse. And all the qualities that he has in the womb, if you gave it to somebody who was born, you'd kill him. And all the qualities that you have in your body that keep you alive, if you gave it to the baby in the womb, you'd kill him. He's an exact opposite life and death situation. And as he's born, there's no hope for him. This child is constructed in a way that's necessary for his existence in the womb. All of those spell death in the external womb, external environment. And as he's born into that world, there's no way he could survive. Speaking personally, I've delivered dozens of babies. To be signed off in obstetrics and gynecology, I had to deliver dozens of babies. And I'll never forget the experience. You deliver this child, you hold this little newborn baby in your hands. First of all, he's bleeding like crazy. The umbilical vessels are pouring out blood. A newborn child has about a cup full of blood, that's all. And he's bleeding like pumping blood out. He's got holes in his heart. He's got everything wrong. He can't breathe. His lungs have never been opened. And as you hold him, after about a minute, he goes blue. A minute and a half later, he goes purple. Starts making this terrible gasping. There's no hope for this kid. And suddenly, as you stand there helpless, the cord clamps down like a cord of steel. The bleeding stops. At exactly the same moment, the holes in the heart close. The blood reverses direction. At the same moment, the blood vessel that takes all the blood from the lungs closes down. The blood hits the lungs. At the same moment, he takes his first breath and the air goes in and meets the blood. And about 3.5 minutes later, it's all reversed and he's doing fine. That must have taken a good few orangutans in the trees to get right by accident in evolution. There must have been many chimpanzees that didn't make it. You just have 3 minutes for it all to reverse. Anyway, so the man says, you must be crazy. That's ridiculous. You're telling me this way, that... And he'd be wrong. Because that's the way it happens. Says the Rambam, never judge the system information from the system after it's been formed. You want to talk about the human body? Take the anatomy of the human body and apply it to the human body. Great. But do not apply the rules that you observe in the system to the stage when the system was coming into being. Different rules applied. Do not take physics and chemistry and science and apply them to the 6 days of creation. That's when the rules were coming into being. You can't use mathematics to analyze a situation when mathematics was not yet. By the way, there are 2 times in Torah like that, the beginning and the end. The 6 days of creation we have no access to. And the Messianic age and post-Messianic age, no idea. Different system. All you're allowed to investigate about the 6 days of creation is the Torah. Meaning, Rabbi Isaac Chava, one of the great commentators, puts it exquisitely. He puts it like this, you can't say it better than this. He says in the whole Torah, except for the 6 days of creation, what the Torah is talking about is literally true. Literally and materially true. Beneath the surface is layer after layer after layer of depth, and eventually, if you penetrate deep enough, you get to the Kabbalah. In the 6 days of creation, the Torah is talking Kabbalah. And if you penetrate deeply enough, you get to the simple literal meaning. And obviously, the 6 days of creation are talking about genetics. It's talking about the spiritual inner world. That's what it's talking about. He says you need as much wisdom to understand what the world looked like in the 6 days of creation as you need wisdom to understand Kabbalah now. That was where the rules were coming into being. All you can know about it. And therefore, says the Gemara, Kavod Elokim Hester Dover, the greatness and glory of Hashem cover it. You cannot go into the 6 days of creation. There are the faculties to see that. After the 6th day of creation, it says Kavod Malachim Chakoy Dover. After the 6th day of creation, Investigate. It's the greatness of the king to see how his world works. But don't apply these rules to that. You're going to get horrible wrong answers. And that's the system. And therefore, when you move into the source of space, you go into the Holy of Holies, space doesn't apply. There's space, but there's no space. You can measure it, then it has no measurement. By the way, Rashi calls that a nes b'soich nes, a miracle within a miracle. Not an ordinary miracle. Ordinary miracles are where something, miraculously expands or shrinks. It's nice. It's a miracle. These are miracles. When we left Egypt and the temple, the process of building the Mishkan and the temple and going to Israel began, we moved into a dimension of connection with the source much more intense than before. Until then, they saw nature manipulated. Abraham was thrown into fire, it didn't burn. Why? Because the fire wasn't allowed to burn him. But when the Jewish people are formed and we move through that process, we move into connection with the source of existence. And there the rules does not apply. The rules become paradoxical. The Sfas Emes says when the sea split, we walk through the water. He says we walk through the water on dry land underwater. Why? Because it says, Bnei Yisrael halchu b'seich hayam b'yavasha, b'toch hayam b'yavasha, in the midst of the ocean on dry land. Read the words. So people say it means on dry land where the ocean used to be. It does not say that. It says they walked through the ocean on dry land, b'toch hayam b'yavasha. Is that possible? No. Did it happen? Yes. The Jewish people are born in impossibility. And therefore, when the Aron is created, in that center, when it's moved into the center of space, you're moving into a dimension where space comes into being, and there it has no space. That's what Israel is. And therefore, the longing for the land of Israel isn't a national homeland. If it was a national homeland, perhaps we should have chosen Florida. There's nicer places. From other, By the way, it's unique. You know that Israel has the features and scenery of the whole world? Isn't that amazing? It's a Middle Eastern country. It has a snow-capped mountain unbelievable. In Israel, you can drive in one day. You can drive through it in one day. It's smaller than the Kruger National Park. They make such a fuss. It's like, it beats me. It's a tiny little speck of land. They make such a fuss about it. The Arab lands, take them and house them some other place. You could give them... Anyway, the point is you can drive through it in one day. And as you drive through Israel, you pass through tropical zones, subtropical zones, deserts. Within 2 hours you can go through a burning, blazing desert to a snow-capped mountain where you freeze. It's the center of the world. There's a little piece of Israel that is the source of all geographic locations. The Medrash says that King Solomon planted crops in Jerusalem that don't grow there. Because he knew the lines of energy that run from Yerushalayim to all the places of the world that they sustain. And on those lines he planted the crops that grow there, and they grew in Yerushalayim. It's the center. The veins and arteries run from there and sustain the land. It's like the heart. That's why it's so important. That's why you have to be pure and on the level if you want to live in Israel. That's why it amplifies and brings out any extremes. That's why it spits out inhabitants that are not worthy. Vomits them out. Other countries not like that. And that's where life is formed. That's where the eternity of the Jewish people is expressed. It's not just a homeland. It's a source of life. And therefore, Tisha B'Av is a time we go back to that tragedy when the spies, they came back and rejected their point of connection with eternity. Not just we don't like the land, we prefer it in the desert. We'd rather go back to Egypt. The point is they were cutting themselves off from the Amalaical connection to eternity. They as the representatives of the Jewish people, the 12 tribes, which is the dimension of inheritance, that they cut that off. That's the tragedy. It's not just that we've lived without a land, so we've had to make do. We're talking about the ultimate spiritual tragedy. Disconnection from the source. And of course, that's what we're longing for. And therefore, let's hope it's not relevant this year. But if it is, this is what to think about. The dimension of longing should be extremely intense. We're not just talking about a practicality. Of course, we would give anything for the simple practicality, just being allowed to live normally. Of course, that comes first. But that's not the reason. The reason is not because it's just a nice place to live and because we can live there unmolested. The real reason is because that's where we connect with spirituality. And the real longing for the land of Israel is a longing for the connection to the higher world. It's the marital longing that the Jewish people have as a wife for a husband. Okay, stop there.